Dear Professor Pincushion, I'm new to sewing and therefore don't have many supplies. I've heard that many experienced sewers have a fabric stash to use, but how do I go about starting my own fabric stash? Mountain Sew. Dear Mountain Sew, let's back up a little bit. Before we even start talking about the fabric stash, we must first consider the housing of the fabric stash. If you think in a remote area of your closet or a couple of bookshelves are going to be enough room, then you haven't properly prepared yourself for the fabric stash. In fact, it's probably a good idea to contact your banker now about adding an addition to your house, or better yet, a whole new house on your property that can hold nothing but fabric. A real fabric stash is big enough in order to warrant warnings of fabric avalanches and the disappearance of small pets and children. Just to be clear, the fabric stash is a character all on its own. You may think you have control, but this is just an illusion. It can grow on its own in the dark like rabbits, and before you know it, you're just maintaining a fabric monster. But this monster is your monster, and you must defend it against fire, floods, and the unsympathetic spouse who rarely understands. In fact, you don't start a fabric stash. The fabric stash starts you. Well, at least starts your descent into fabric madness. It starts off innocently enough. Okay, so you're learning how to sew and you start off with a couple of projects. It's very common as a beginner to be paranoid you're not going to have enough fabric to finish, so maybe you buy just a little bit extra. When you finish a project, you have just a big enough piece of scrap that it seems wasteful just to throw it away, so you keep it. I mean, it's just a little piece of fabric. It hardly takes up any room at all. And you're so sure that someday the perfect project will come along where this little fabric scrap will play a fundamental role and become a hero. After a few projects, suddenly you have a mound of fabric. Hey there, little buddy, you're so cute. Now this pile may look innocent enough, but there's an ongoing trend that everything you make happens to be too big to actually use any of this fabric. But we ignore this and continue on, unaware of what the future holds. If this was all that occurred, it really wouldn't be so bad. But there's a larger force that contributes to the fabric stash. I'm gonna go ahead and bring in another character. Gonna call her Aunt Betty. Now in your situation, her name may be different and she may not even be related to you. But this is such a common occurrence for many of us that I'm gonna go ahead and coin a term. Aunt Betty Fabric Stash Factor. What is the Aunt Betty Fabric Stash Factor? Well, let's just say word starts getting around that you've picked up a new hobby and suddenly Aunt Betty mentions she's given up the craft. But you can totally have some of her fabric. Yay! Free fabric! What you may not realize is that she's passing her stash on to you. Despite giving up sewing, there's still an attachment to the fabric. We're like fabric pirates, and we have our textile treasure that we love to pour over. And it doesn't matter if that treasure is covered with chili peppers, chickens, or cartoon kangaroos. She could have given it all to a thrift store, but she's been waiting for you, someone that will treasure her fabric as much as she has. So while you thought you were going to get a few yards of fabric, you suddenly find yourself in possession of a garbage bag full of fabric. You'll even pull out a few scraps, and Aunt Betty will chuckle and say, "Oh dear, I remember making something out of that, but this scrap was too big to throw away. It'd be perfect for a crazy quilt." Stop and remember this. This is your future, and even if you know what's going on, you won't be able to stop yourself from accepting the fabric stash because the temptation is too great and the fabric pirate must add to his booty. And all this is not counting the number of times you walked into a fabric store and then walked out with fabric that was too adorable and purchased just because. This is the most dangerous type of contribution to the fabric stash. You're purchasing fabric without having a project in mind, so it sits in your stash for years. So when you do want to use it, now it's been discontinued, and if you cut it and make a mistake, then it's forever ruined, and it's too cute to be ruined, so back in the stash it goes. I've created a pie chart showing the makeup of a typical fabric stash. So we have fabric too ugly to use, donated from Aunt Betty, fabric too cute to use, fabric scraps, and last but not least, the smallest part, fabric that is usable. Even if you have the most impressive fabric stash that fills a whole room, when it comes time for your next project, nothing in your stash will do. So you gotta go back to the fabric store, buy more fabric, maybe buy a little bit extra. We don't want to run out. Oh, and that fabric's cute, and that fabric's cute. Maybe buy a couple yards of that just because. I better call my banker again.